Hello and welcome to this first video in our series of tutorials for the Information Technology Administration module. Today we will be setting up a Windows server and a Windows client PC, and we'll be connecting them to each other using Active Directory. Now this is called tutorial 0 for a very simple reason, and that is that we have to complete these steps before we do any of the subsequent steps. So whenever we have to create groups and users later on, we will need to have done this first, because we are setting up a server by putting in the disk, and we're setting up an XP computer by putting in a disk as well. Okay, and to explain, we'll be using VirtualBox as well, which is a piece of software you'll need to have installed, along with having obtained the ISOs for Windows Server and Windows XP beforehand. I will give you those in class. Once you have those, you can set up VirtualBox, and VirtualBox is basically an environment whereby instead of having to have a physical computer, which is very cumbersome and awkward because you actually have to plug something in and run it and set it up, we're running it virtually. We're running a computer inside a window inside another computer. And we're going to run both of these at the same time. So to get started, what we're going to do is we're going to click on New here in VirtualBox, and it's going to ask us now to name our operating system. So I'm going to say Server 2003, and from there I'm going to say, let me see, I'm going to put my initials at the start, and I'm going to put an underscore and the year at the end. So you should do something similar to yourself so that it signifies in some way by name that it's yours and what year the machine was made. Then from the type list, Windows, you should have Windows selected here, and then version. We're not setting up the XP right now, we're setting up the server, so this is incorrect. If we go to the drop down list, we can choose 2003 and click next. Okay, so this next screen lets us configure the amount of RAM that our computer has, and I'm going to increase mine, but you can leave yours as default. I've got considerably more RAM in my PC than the school ones would, so I can afford to add more to it, because this will actually use up this much memory on the physical computer that the whole thing is running on. So leave it at 256, and if you need to increase it, you can in the settings at a later stage. So click on next. Next up, we need to set up a virtual hard disk. So because this is a virtual computer, it's not using real hardware. Well, it's utilizing the real hardware of the PC it's running on, but it's not a real PC itself. The hard drive that's going to store its information also has to be virtual or fake. So what we're going to do is we're going to create a new virtual hard drive. As you can see, that's selected as default, and then click create. And we can leave it as default type of VirtualBox disk image. And dynamically allocated, that basically means that if we tell it we want it to be a 10 gigabyte hard drive, if we only use 3 gigabytes of that, the file that's stored in your PC will only be 3 gigabytes. So dynamically allocated means that you can have a big system if you want, but it's more space efficient if you don't use that initially or don't use it in the end. So we're going to stick with dynamically allocated and click next, and then it's going to ask us where we want to save it. So I'm going to point to a location on my computer, which is virtual machines. Okay. You should point to a location on your own portable storage device, like a memory stick or hard drive, or the desktop of the PC, or a folder you create on the PC. But basically, you need to choose a location where you want to save this to, and just be aware of where that is. I would advise having it on yourself, so on a memory stick or a hard drive. It just means that if anything goes wrong, or you have to move computer, or something goes wrong with your PC, you have the details. You have the actual setup so far. Okay, and as you can see, as default, it's saying 20 gigabytes is the size of this hard drive. That's perfectly fine. Say if we only use 3 or 4 of that, that's all it'll take up in your memory stick. So we can click on create. Okay, so this is basically now ready to start up and start installing. And what we do to that is we find it in our list. So we can see here DD Server 2003-16 is on this list and powered off. If I double click on it, it should start up. Okay, so the thing is, I'm recording on my second screen right now. So as a result, this has popped up on the wrong screen. So I'll just drag this across to show you. This will pop up initially asking you which disk would you like to boot with, and what we want to actually boot with is the ISO for Windows Server 2003 installation. So once you've got a copy of that from me, you should be able to navigate to wherever you save that to. So for example, if it's on your memory stick, find your memory stick and find Windows Server 2003 or 2 Enterprise with Service Pack 2 CD-ROM or CD1.iso, and I'll just double click that and click start. And I'll just drag this into view as well. This is now our VirtualBox computer starting up. As you can see, it's now going to the old Windows setup menu. Now you might ask, why am I using Windows Server 2003 whenever there's newer versions available? And the answer to that question is quite simple. The newer versions of Server require different types of licensing, which are more pain in the backside. So we're going to use Server 2003, where we can do that quite simply. Now, in this video, I'm just going to set it up with a grace period of 30 days. That means we have 30 days to complete all tutorials and get them documented. we can put a license key in, and maybe in a later video I'll actually find a license key that works for it and we'll put that in instead. Okay, so now we've got the setup for our Server 2003, and you can see it says to set up Windows now, press enter, so we're going to do that. And now it comes up with a license agreement. We can click F8 to agree to that. And then it asks us how we'd like to partition our hard drive. Since we're not going to do anything special with that, we can just press the return key or enter key as it's described there, and it will create the default partition, which means take up the entire hard drive. And then we're going to partition it as NTFS. Okay, so I'm going to use the quick option because if I tell it to format it full, it means it's basically resetting all zeros and ones to zeros, so any previous information is completely eradicated. That's irrelevant on a virtual machine. And also, quick takes a lot less time. As you can see, it's already done and it's already moved on to copying the setup files. Okay, so a brief explanation as to why I chose NTFS over FAT32. NTFS is a Microsoft developed file system which supports large files over 4 gigabytes in size and hard drives of larger sizes as well. So that might not affect us here, but it's a good thing to get into the habit of doing that. When you're setting up a Windows operating system on a hard drive, you use something like NTFS. Now, what are the limitations? Well, NTFS only works on Microsoft systems. You can get third-party drivers to make it work on other systems, but as default, it's a Microsoft product, therefore it works on Microsoft systems. FAT32, however, has a lot of issues as well. You can't have files over 4 gigabytes in size. You're limited as to how big hard drives can be, and all of those different things. So I'm just going to click return here, by the way. So to skip the reboot so we don't have to wait around. This is now restarting the computer. Okay, so when this computer now restarts, it's going to ask if you want to boot from CD. Don't do it, just let it work away, because the files from the CD we need are already copied over. That step is completely irrelevant to us at this stage. Okay, so basically now what we're going into is the proper installation for Windows Server 2003. We're going to actually have to configure things now. So the first thing that's going to pop up is going to let us actually configure the language settings and the location settings for Windows Server 2003. And I'd just like to point out as well that the software I'm using to record this video doesn't offer a pause button, so if I'm waiting around for steps to complete like right now, I'm just going to describe the system we're actually building and why, because I can't pause the video. Okay, so basically it's now installing devices, so that means your keyboard, mouse, different hardware inside the computer. Very important things to actually have installed. As default, what we'll install will be enough for us. We won't need to get any extra drivers from elsewhere, which is really handy. It means that the steps we have to follow to actually set up this server are pretty straightforward. Okay, so once this is completed, which should be done now momentarily, we'll be able to set up the location and the keyboard as well, which is important because if we're using an Irish computer, which I am, the layout of the keyboard is slightly different than a US keyboard. The @ sign and the double quote signs are actually swapped in locations for one. So if you set up the wrong type of keyboard, which it will as default, then you'll find that some buttons are not in the locations which you think they are. They're not in the same place as the picture would describe on the button on the keyboard itself. Okay, so here on our first setup menu, we can go to Customize. And we can choose, first of all, standards and formats. We want English Ireland standards and format. So that means things like time, currency, how numbers are described, how the short dates are written. So, for example, you can see it's day followed by month instead of month followed by day there. And long date as well. So I'm just going to keep going down. I can press the E button to scroll through all the letter E countries. But I can also open up the menu and find Ireland as well. And similarly down here, I can find Ireland in the list. So I'm just going to go up until I find Ireland. And there we go, Ireland. And then languages, we can go in there and we can click on the details button, and this is where we're going to set up our keyboard. So down here we can add another keyboard by clicking add, and it'll ask us to go through the list until we find the one we want. So I'm just going to keep pressing the E button until I come across Ireland. So you see English Ireland and keyboard layout IME. So just to point out why I'm pressing the E button whenever I'm looking for Ireland, it's because it's English language but Ireland layout. Okay, so that is correct to us. We're going to be speaking and mostly using the computer in English, but it's going to be Ireland that we're using it from. So we can click on OK, and you'll see now that it's got the two of these. We need to remove the US one, and this is a little tricky thing that's in older versions of Windows, that when you click remove and click apply, it's going to complain and say, you can't remove it, you're currently using it. So click OK, click the US keyboard again, remove a second time, and persistence pays off in this case. So now we can go to advanced in this tab for regional and language options, and we can once again go English Ireland. Click apply, and there's all our region settings set up. So if you're wondering what this details button does, it brings up the keyboard layout details menu that we found inside customize already, so we don't need to do anything there. So we can click on next. Now it's going to ask us to give a name to our users. or to our user and to our organization. And look, we just keep this simple. I'll put in user and OFI. And I'll click next. Okay, so this is a screen for the license key. We're not going to put a license key in for now, which gives us a grace period of 30 days. At a later stage, we may look at putting an actual license key in, but we'll leave that alone for now. So we'll click on next, and it's going to say, are you sure you don't want to put in a license key? The answer is no, we don't want to put in a license key. So just make sure you click on no, and it should continue. Now it's going to ask us what way the server's licensed. We can leave this as default because we only have a small amount of computers we're going to use with it, but that should usually be picked up by your license key. If not, you can configure that there's 100 possible users, or there's a license per device, whatever actually kind of suits your business. For now, we leave that alone. In later versions of Windows, this is simplified as well. Let's click on next. Now it's going to ask us to name the server. So I'm going to name this DD server 16. Okay, so that's just a basic name to the server, Dwayne Daly server 16. And then for an administrator password, I'm going to keep this simple, and I advise you do the same. I'm going to put password 1 with a capital P. And if you're wondering why I'm putting the capital P in there, is because later on when we start configuring the server, there's going to be a password, there's going to be a rule governing what passwords can be there, and there's going to be a requirement to have at least one capital and one number, and that's why I don't just put password as the password. I'm putting the capital P to suffice for the capital letter requirement, and the number 1 for the numerical requirement. So click on next, and this is now going to go back to setting up our time zone. As you can see, it's picking up the time I'm recording this video at. I can go to time zone, and we're in Greenwich Mean Time, GMT. Okay, that just means that your time set up correctly on the server. We can click on next, and this is now going back to setting up the network for this server. Okay, and there's going to be a few steps along the way, as I say here, that are going to take a little bit longer than I'd like, because I can't pause the video. So let's talk about what we're actually going to do with this server. We're going to set up a utility called Active Directory on our server, and essentially what Active Directory is it's a listing of users and computers, or at least in the way we're going to use it, it's going to be a listing of users and computers on our computer. Okay, so I'm going to complete these steps and I'll continue talking about that. So networking settings, typical settings are fine. Work group, we don't need to worry about that. We'll be setting up a domain, so that work group is going to be completely null and void shortly. Next. Okay, so that's back to configuration. So our Active Directory has all our users and our computers in it, and we can set up organizational units inside of that, so that we can say have all the computers for a certain room in a particular folder. We can have all the users that are, say, students in a certain folder, and we can even break those down into individual classes, and we can do the same with, say, teachers. I speak from the point of view of students and teachers because I'm a teacher, so that's a scenario I'm quite familiar with. But of course, you can set up other groups. So for example, you can set up web designers and programmers, because they may need different privileges, and we'll talk about that again later. But basically, when we set up stuff in Active Directory, a structure for our users and our computers, we can then apply permissions to specific users and computers. So we could say that in a particular computer room, people can only use certain facilities, or that a certain class group cannot access memory sticks but others can, as may be necessary for the setting up of the school or business. So there's lots of possibilities of what we might want to do with the server, but that's a great thing about a server. A server really is just a normal Windows computer with some extra facilities running on top of it. So whenever we do the Windows XP setup shortly, you'll see that everything I'm doing here will look quite familiar, and that's because it's nearly the same steps. Later on, we'll see there's some extra stuff added in, but it's not really that different at this stage. Okay, so a server is basically just a computer with extra facilities for services made available to the people using the system, hence the name server. But why is a server, when you actually buy a physical server, why does it look the way it does? That's a very simply answered question, and that is, it's a big badass computer that we need to do a lot of work, so we need to take some precautions. We also need to make it good and powerful. And also sometimes we want to put it in a special type of cabinet, and that can alter the shape as well. But it's really just a computer with extra stuff in it. So for example, it might have a second power supply in case the first fails, and it might have extra hard drives in case hard drives fail. So that's known as redundancy. It's just extra facilities in place in case of failure. And also we might most likely have a bucket of RAM inside, and possibly even 2 processors or more processors inside a high-end server. So that's just to facilitate the fact that it's going to do an awful lot of work. But the truth is, any PC could be turned into a server by just installing a server operating system on it and enabling the facilities which are relevant to you. So you could run a server at home. Okay, and I've known many people over the years that have done that because it suited their needs. They wanted to be able to share resources throughout their house in a certain way, and the server was the best one to offer that. You can do a certain degree of that using work groups and just client PCs like Windows XP, Windows 7 and 10, but you're still limited as to what you can do. So a server is the ultimate answer when you want to share resources. Okay, so what resources are we going to share this year? The main resources we're going to share is we're going to share files and we're going to share printers. Now, there's a lot of other things we can do as well. For example, databases, which we will look at a later stage. Media servers. We will have to set up DHCP and DNS, so that means address allocation and name services. A server, basically, it just offers all these facilities from one centralized location. So when we want our clients to do something, we just point them at the right location and it does the rest of the work. And in the long run, even though a server takes a while to set up, in the long run it saves us an awful lot of hassle. Okay, so you might have noticed there that this computer has now restarted. I'm now going to let that count down, just not going to press anything on the keyboard, and our server is going to start up for the first time. Now, servers are notoriously slow at starting up, especially if it's a physical server, because there's so many extra things that have to be enabled on startup. So just be aware that whenever you're setting up a server, if it's a physical server, you could be talking 5 minutes before you can do anything useful with it. Okay, so now we've got our server 2003 to a point that we can actually log into it. To do this, we can't press Control-Delete on our actual keyboard because that'll bring up the task manager for that computer. We want to bring it up in this virtual computer, and there's a very simple answer to that. You go up to Machine up top, you'll see the option Insert Control-Delete is there. If we click on that, it'll send the command Control-Delete. Now we can log in. So you should be able to now log in using administrator, and the administrator password you previously entered, which should be password 1. And I can click OK, and now my server should actually start up. Okay, so since this is the first time around, it's a little bit slow, but as you can see now, what it's asking for is me to insert the second disk, and that's something I really should do. So what I also will do is I'm going to make this desktop a little bit bigger because it's a little bit small at the moment. I'm going to right click, go Properties and Settings, and we can now change the resolution. So I'm going to change this to 1024 by 768. It'll just make everything a little bit more visible. Yes. Okay, I'll just move this back into display of the recording window. Okay, and then we can click on OK. So what about this disk? Basically, Windows Server 2003 as default doesn't have all the information it needs on disk 1, so we need to put disk 2 in. As you can see, it says please insert CD2. So to do this, we can go up to device, and there'll be an option here for CD and DVD devices, and we should be able to go to an option called choose a virtual CD DVD disk file. This should now bring up hopefully the location you were in previous where you opened up disk 1, and we should be able to choose English Windows Server 2003 or Release 2 Enterprise with Service Pack 2 CD2. So double click on that and click OK, and the server should hopefully now continue with its installation process. So click on Next, I accept the license agreement, yes, and Next, copy files. So this server is now approaching the point where we can actually use it, and while that's actually going on, I'm going to show you a little bit of setup for this server, because right now the way the networking works in this PC is it's passing the information through from your actual computer, which we don't want. We want an isolated network. So to achieve the isolated network, we're going to go to our VirtualBox configuration menu and right click on our server and go to Settings. And from here we should be able to go to Network and choose Attached to. That will let us change how this is done. So currently it's set to NAT, which stands for Network Address Translation, which translates the addresses of this virtual network through to addresses for the actual network so you can access the internet. We don't want that because that could conflict with other systems on the local network. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to click on that and I'm going to choose Internal Network. And I'm going to make one other change as well. See where it says Promiscuous Mode? I want to click Allow All. And the reason for that is that if I don't actually set that, there could be access issues later on whenever we try to get the computers to communicate with each other. So we're going to make sure Internal Network and Promiscuous Mode set to Allow All. With that okayed, we can go back to our virtual machine. I can see it now says Finish. So it's now saying that before we go live, would you like to install updates? We're going to leave it as default. We don't need any updates for what we're doing. So we're going to click on Finish, and this will now, as you can see, do you want to close this? Yes. This is now a server ready to do serving. Okay, so before I continue with this, what I'm going to do is I'm going to configure the network address. And you see it's popped up here already for me. But just in case that doesn't happen, I'm going to show you how to do it manually. So to set up the network address, we're going to go to Start, Control Panel, Network Connections, and Local Area Network. Just make sure the settings we set up in VirtualBox there a moment ago are done before you try to do this. So we click on Local Area Connection and then Properties. And then we can click on Internet Protocol TCP IP. This will bring up now the properties for configuring IP address. For the server, we want its address to never change because it's something we need to be constantly able to contact. So we're going to say use the following IP address, and I'm going to type in 192.168.0.1. Okay? And I'm then just going to go to the next box and let it fill that in as well. And then for DNS, I'm going to set it to the same as well, because we're going to set up a DNS server shortly, and we're saying use yourself for that. There's also a special address we can use for that. That's 127.0.0.1, which means yourself, as in it's the address that basically refers to you. I won't type that in here, but just it's useful to know. So once you've that done, you can click on OK and close and close. And now it's got that address configured for this computer. Okay, so what we need to do now is we've got a server, but it's not actually providing any services as such. So what we want to do is we want to go to manage your server, which should have popped up as default, and click the add or remove role button. However, if this manage your server box does not appear, you can go to start, administrative tools, and look for manage your server. And from here you can then perform the same actions. So we're going to go to add or remove a role and click on next. And what it's going to do is it's going to check our network out to see what the current configuration is. And once it's done this, it'll ask us if we want to perform a standard first time setup or if we want to do something special. And for the sake of this video, we're just going to go with the basic because that's all we really need. If you're doing a more advanced setup, you could set up things individually and have more control in the configuration, but this will work perfectly fine for what we need. So typical configuration for server and next. Now it's going to ask us to name our domain. So this is the name we're going to use to refer to our domain at all times. We're going to leave the .local part, but let's rename this first part. And I'm going to name it DD Server 2016. So I'm changing it slightly from the server name just so I can differentiate between the two things. But notice how it's my initials again and the fact it's a server and the year is 2016. So with that done, you should be able to click on next. And it'll bring us to the next stage of the configuration of our server. Okay, so what we need to look at very shortly is actually setting up our XP, and there's no reason we can't do the same, or the two of them at the same time. So when this install gets underway, we will actually start our XP. Okay, so NetBIOS name, just leave that as default, next, and we're nearing the point now where it's going to start installing. So what's the next menu? Okay, there we go. DNS forwarding. So basically, DNS stands for domain name service, and that works whenever someone says, this is the name of the computer or the domain I need to access. So for example, Dwayne's PC or Google.ie, those are domain or computer names. If I want to find the IP address for that, I can query a DNS server. Now this server is going to be set up as a DNS server. However, it's not going to have all the answers. It's not going to know the location of Google because it's only going to store information relevant to it. So if this server is going to be used on the internet, which it isn't, but if it was, you could point to a server on the internet to forward queries to if there's an issue. So for example, if I type 8.8.8.8, that's actually the DNS server run by Google, which works quite well. So it's worthwhile putting it in. It'll not advantage us during the tutorial, but it's a good thing to do. Then click next, and that's saying what we're going to do is install DHCP if required, install Active Directory in DNS, create the following domain, and then forward queries. So then if we click on next and OK, it's telling us that it's going to restart during this process. So basically what we're going to do is we're going to let it install until it restarts. That's essentially what we're going to do. So while that's happening, we're going to set up XP. So click on OK, and as you can see, it's now saying, could you please insert disk 1? So do that. We can go back up to the top of our VirtualBox window, click on devices, CD DVDs, and choose a virtual disk drive. You should be able to find CD1 there and click on OK. And what should happen now is it should start copying the files off of the disk and starting up those services. So while that's going ahead, let's go back to our main VirtualBox window and set up our XP computer. Okay, so our XP computer is going to be set up very similar to our Windows Server, as you'll see, but there's slightly less steps involved. So the first step is to go to New, and I'm going to follow the same step again. I'm going to go DD XP, and I'm going to go 16 at the end of it. Okay, and then it's, as you can see, it's default. It already says Microsoft Windows XP. That's perfectly fine. So we click on next. It's going to ask us how much RAM we want. 192 megabytes should be loads of RAM for what we're doing, so don't worry about changing that. Click on next. Same as before, create a virtual hard disk, yes. Same as before, VirtualBox disk image, all of these are fine. Dynamically allocated, yes. Now we need to tell it a location. I'm going to do the same again. I'm going to tell it the location on my hard drive. You choose the same location as you did before for your server. Okay, so then I can click on create. And now I can double click to start this computer. And it's going to ask me once again to insert the disk. And the disk I want to insert this time, if I go down through my list here, is Windows XP Professional with Service Pack 3 32-bit ISO. So if I double click on that and click start and drag this window over, you'll see now there's a second computer. So you can see I've actually got one computer here and a second computer here running beside each other. So there's two different virtual computers running alongside each other, perfectly fine. And that's a great thing about this. If you want to actually set up a number of computers, you can actually set them up very quickly next to each other. And as you can see, our server is now restarting because it has completed its install process. So let's continue with our XP while that's in the process of restarting. So once again, press enter to continue, F8 to license, enter to create default partition, and NTFS quick. Click, and now it's copying the files for XP to the hard drive. Okay, so I can't really do very much now for a moment while the two computers are doing their job. And that's one thing about being an administrator. There is times where all you can really do is sit around and wait for processes to finish. If you want to try and achieve something with that time, if you have a second or third computer you can work on, move on to it and maybe move between them. Just be aware that if you're doing that, don't accidentally skip steps. It's important that you complete all necessary steps. Okay. So our server is now preparing network connections and our Windows XP install is currently copying files. So momentarily our server will be ready for us to actually do our basic configuration on it. And what we're going to do is we're going to create a test user account on our server. And once we've got that done, we should be able to finish off our XP install and actually get our XP computer connected. Okay, so I'm going to go back to my server, machine, insert Control-Alt-Delete, and I'm going to log in by typing password 1. So that's the same as previous. Press enter. And now our server should be set up. And I'm going to show you the extra stuff that's actually been set up now. Okay, so as you can see, it's finishing this process and finish. Done. Okay, so we can close this managed server. We don't need any more roles from that right now. I should be able to go to administrative tools. And we should have now added to this list Active Directory users and computers, which we're going to become extremely familiar with. DNS and DHCP. So we'll start off by showing you DHCP. DHCP basically means that this server is now capable of giving addresses out, so we don't have to manually configure like we did with the server the address for every computer. So if I open out the different subsections of this and go to address pool, you can see that currently this server is set up to give addresses from 192.168.0.10 to 192.168.0.254. Okay, I'm just going to restart this. And if we wanted, we could right click and add an exclusion range. So if we needed more addresses reserved for things like printers or other servers or other systems in the place, we could do that. But for what we're doing, it's perfectly fine. We have 8 addresses available to everybody. So we can do what we want with those. Okay. So that is our DHCP server. As you can see right now, the lease is given out is none because there's no computer using it. We will have a look at this list again later once we actually reach that point. So I'll just minimize this. Next up, we've got our DNS, and DNS is the domain name service. And we can open this out and look up forward table, and we can just, let me see, find our list here, MSDCS. On this list here, DD server 2016.local, there is all names that are registered with the server, and right now the only name and address that's registered with it is its own name and the address that's associated. So you can see that that's basically all it stores. It stores lists which say this name refers to this. When we go back to this later on, you'll see our Windows XP computer will be added to that list, and we'll know that DDXP 2016 can be accessed using the address 192.168.0, and it'll probably be .10. Okay, as you can see, because I didn't activate it, it's constantly reminding me I need to activate. So I'll minimize that for now. So what we need to really work on for now is administrative tools and users and computers. This is we're going to set up all the users and computers for this machine. And I'm just watching this XP as well. So you can see that install process is still underway. Alright, so if we open this out, this is where we can add in our computers. So as default, computers will be added to there, and as default, users will be added to there. Now, when in the next tutorial, we'll actually look at creating a new organizational unit, which means we can actually have users. So for example, I could call it Dwayne server users, and I could then create inside of that teachers, students, and then another subfolder for, say, whatever, class A, class B, class C. Okay, so I can manage them really well inside of this. For now, we're not going to worry about that, but we can. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to hop back to my Windows XP machine, because we're around the point now where we're going to be actually able to set it up. So we're going to do the exact same steps we did before. And don't worry about if your XP is not ready yet. The steps are the same as the server. You should know them at this stage. So customize English Ireland and Ireland. Yep. Language details. Add Irish keyboard, English Ireland. Okay. Remove US. It complains. Remove it again. Apply. Advanced English Ireland for this option as well. And okay. And we can now click next, and we do the same again. User OFI. Next. And it's going to ask me to put a license key in. I'm actually going to put a license key into this one, but what I'm going to do is I'm going to give that out to you. Well, I'm going to type it in for you. So I'm going to drag this over to another screen and enter it in, and then click the next button. So just bear with me for one moment. Okay, so if I'm silent, it's because I'm typing. Let's just hope I typed this correctly the first time around. Alright, so I don't have to keep checking it. So be very careful if you're ever entering a license key like this to type it exactly right, because it will complain. And there we go. So I've entered that in, and I can now drag this back onto our window. It says, what do I want to name this computer? So I'm just going to name it, as I said in the description previously, DDXP 2016. And administrative password, just to keep everything linear, I'm going to put password 1 in again with a capital P. Click next. It just means that later on, when you're going to use this computer in a week or two's time, you actually know how to log in. Right, so Greenwich Mean Time for our time zone next, and let's let that work away. So while that's now doing its thing and we're waiting for it to pop up at the next dialog, let's go to Active Directory users and computers and create a user account we can log into our server with. We don't want to use the administrator one for that because they're both the same, therefore we wouldn't know which one's actually logging in as default. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to right click and go to New User. And a menu should now pop up which lets us set up the information for our user. So what I'm going to do is first name Dwayne, last name Daly, and then login name can be whatever you want, but I'm going to put Dwayne.Daly. Okay, and then click next, and then it's going to ask me to put a password. Just as I said, to keep everything linear, I'm going to put password 1, capital P on both cases. And you can see the default option here is user must change password next logon. We don't want that. Okay, so I'm going to tick that off and then say user cannot change password and password never expires. Make sure this option is not selected, otherwise you can't use the account as default. And then we're finished. That account has been created. We now just have to finish our XP machine. Okay, so network settings, typical. Work group is fine. We just need to let that finish its actual setup process. Once that's done, we've basically got our XP client and our server ready. Okay, so what else can we actually do while we're waiting? Well, let's have a look at what's actually here in our users list. As you can see, we've got a bunch of we've got single faces, we've got double faces. A double face here means a group. So a group can contain any number of members, and by using groups, whenever you want to give permissions to something, for example, if I said I made a folder for class A to use and I didn't want any other class to be able to use that folder, I could say class A folder. Permissions, class A can use this. Instead of having to go, John Smith can use this, Jane Smith can use this, and having to individually name the students of that group. It also means that if halfway through the year a new person has to be added, you don't have to maybe search in 6 or 7 different locations for that person to actually get the thing right. So let's actually have a look here and see, there's our administrator account. Is there an administrator's enterprise admin? Let's see if there's anybody in this list. So members, as you can see, the administrator is an administrator of our enterprise, which makes sense. Similarly, domain admins, that should also include administrator. So what I could do is I could say that I want my user, Dwayne.Daly, to also be an administrator. Because I am the administrator of this network, it makes sense that my personal account can control the domain. So what I've done there is, I'll just actually go through those steps again. Domain admins, double click, members, add, and then you can type in, if you know the name exactly of who you're looking for, you can type their name in and click on OK. And you can see now Dwayne Daly is listed as a member of the domain admins. Okay, so that means I now have control of the server. I could log into the server as myself and actually perform important tasks on it. Okay, so there's our users now set up. And this is nearing a state where we can actually do something useful with it. Alright, so as you'll see here, if I go to control panel on my server, we can see all the standard stuff we'd see in control panel on standard Windows PC. So for example, internet options, game controllers. So that should show you very much so that a Windows server is not necessarily just something to sit in a corner that never gets used unless something breaks. You technically could plug a game controller in and play a game on this, because it is just roughly a Windows XP machine, but with extra stuff installed on top. Like, the big difference visually is that it uses the old grey menu bar at the bottom, the taskbar and start menu. But the truth is, in Windows XP, you can enable that as well. So it's taken away the nice things so that we're not using up any power of the server on displaying a fancy interface on something that's not going to actually, well, nobody's going to care about how fancy it looks because it's there as a workhorse. Okay, so over the course of this module and these tutorials, what else we'll be looking at? All the things we'll be looking at is we'll be looking at the domain security policy. That will allow us to set restrictions to each user or group. That means that we could state, for example, that students are unable to access the control panel or change the desktop background on the computer, which is a very useful one, as you'll find, to actually enable. The event viewer, we might look at that at some stage. The event viewer is available in both a server and a Windows normal PC, and it lists events occurring, which could be faults or it could be warnings. Okay, and then manager server. So at any stage, you can add more services to your server. You can set up remote desktop. Okay, so it looks like VirtualBox has now crashed for me, which is always handy. Okay, so why has my server crashed? So my XP client seems to have broken. So if you just bear with me for one moment, I'm going to try and find out why. Okay, so it's completely frozen up. So let's see if we can double click it. See if this actually, I'm just hoping now I don't have to go through the entire install for XP again. It's very possible that it didn't save anything. Start Windows normally, please. Alright, so I'm not entirely sure what crashed there, but our Windows XP during its install did fail, which is always a nice thing to happen. Okay, but you can see that despite that, it's once I actually closed it and opened it again, it worked, which is always great when that happens. Alright, so what I'm going to do is, as you see, Windows XP, first time it says, visual elements look crappy. Would you like to adjust that? Yeah. So as you can see, it's now made the window a bit bigger, and just in case it didn't work, it asked us, do we want to revert or keep the properties? So after 30 seconds, if, say, you weren't getting it on your screen, it should revert to the old settings, and then you should be able to use the computer again. Because there's always a fear that when you change settings, suddenly your computer can't actually be used, and that could be troublesome. Okay, so you'll see now that Windows XP has a thing called the out-of-box experience, and this is what would generally come up on any computer you buy in a shop whenever you bring it home, and this lets you set up a user account for you and things like that there. Windows Server doesn't have the same because generally people don't buy a server with this pre-installed, they set it up themselves. Alright, so next, help protect my PC, not right now, leave all of that automatic updates alone. We're not connected to the internet. And no, so what I want to actually do is, while it's telling me that I'm not connected to the internet, let's change a setting here. We want to go back to VirtualBox, right click and go settings, and go to network, internal network, and promiscuous mode allow all, just like we did with the server previously. And then we can click OK, and that's now on the same local only network or internal only network as the server, so they should be able to communicate with each other. So click on next. When it says users, we'll just set up user as our default user. No reason to do anything else. We'll be using the server to log in, and finish. Okay, so our Windows XP machine should now start up and be fully usable. Alright, so what we need to do now is I want to make sure that my local administrator account is enabled and working, because if anything goes wrong later on, we want to be able to use that. And then we want to add this to the domain. So to check our user accounts, we can right click on my computer and go to manage. Okay, so if you click on that, it should bring up the computer management screen, and from here we should be able to find local users and groups, users, and administrator. And just to make sure I know the password for this, I'm going to click on it, click set password, and I'm going to type in a password twice. So if at any stage on a PC you need to actually reset the password for an account, this is how you can do it quite easily if you're an administrator for that machine. So click OK, password has been set. So I now definitely have an administrator account. What I also wanted to check was to make sure that this account is not disabled. The way I'd know if it was disabled is if this red X was shown beside the face picture. It's not, but if it was, I could double click and you'll see account is disabled, would be ticked. So I'm going to make sure that that's not ticked and that password never expires. So click OK. Our user accounts are set up. Now what we need to do is we need to actually connect our XP computer to the server. So to do that, what we're going to do is my computer, right click and go to properties this time. And now we can go to computer name and change. And from here we can change the name of our computer, as you can see here. I'm happy enough with what's there, but if you want to change it, by all means change the user or the name of your computer. Just make sure that before you connect to the domain, the next step, restart your computer at least once. Okay? So restart the computer after changing the name before adding to a domain. Otherwise it gets confused as to what name to use. Just make sure you do that. Okay, so if you're happy with the name, click on domain, and we're going to now type in the name of the domain. So what did I actually say was the name of the domain? I believe I said it as DD server 2016.local. So if I type that correctly and click OK, what should come up is a dialog asking me for a username and password, which is the server's administrator username and password. So what I should be able to do is I should be able to go Dwayne.daily as well, because I told the domain that is now an administrator. So let's see if it accepts that. So click OK and let's see what happens. So welcome to the domain. So this means now this XP computer is connected to our Windows Server 2003 domain that we set up, which means we can push user accounts and folders and resources to that computer from a central location by an administrator configuring it. So if I click OK and say OK again, and click OK, it'll now ask us if we'd like to restart. Before we can actually use the domain, we need to restart the computer. So let's restart this computer and check it out. So with that done, what I should be able to do now is go back to my server and actually check a few things. So in Active Directory, I should be able to go to computers, and what should hopefully be listed there if I refresh is the first computer. So you can see DDXP 2016 is now listed as a computer on this Active Directory, which means I could manage it. I could disable that account, for example, and that computer would no longer be able to log into the domain. So if that computer was misbehaving, I could actually cause an issue, or I could actually stop it from doing that problem. So DNS now as well, we should now be able to refresh that as well. And it hasn't appeared as of yet, but we'll check that out in a moment. Let me see. Okay, so the DNS hasn't actually got the record for the name yet, but it will. So let's open it up again and just see if it's appeared. Sometimes it can take a couple of hours for a DNS server to actually get all the records. So forward lookup table, and has it appeared yet? It hasn't. Okay, so we'll check out the address for it now in a moment as well, just to see what that has actually been set at. So after a while, the actual DNS record for that XP computer should appear there. We'll find out what the address of that is now on the actual PC. And then DHCP, let's see if it's been given an address. Address leases, nothing shown there. Refresh. As you can see, it's saying that client IP address is 192.168.0.10, and that's for DDXP 2016. So the server now knows that this client computer is getting an address from it. So let's log into this machine using the server account and make sure that works for us. So what we got to do is make sure that we're not actually logging in using this here. We go to options, and you'll see it says log on to this computer. We don't want to log on to this computer anymore. We want to log on to the server, which you'll see should be listed DD server 2016. Now I should be able to put in any server account I created. For example, I created Dwayne.daily, enter the password, and now it's logging in using an account it's getting from the server. So this is the start of what our server's doing for us. It might look like it's a lot of work, but scale this up to 500 computers with 500 users. Instead of having to set up 25,000 different accounts, as in 500 per machine, we set them up once on the server and connect each client once, and everything's working. So that's 1,000 setups instead of 25,000. It's a big difference. Or 250,000 is it even? Yes. Okay, so our XP machine is now connected to the server. What I'm going to do is I'm just going to check to see that that address is definitely right by going to run and typing in CMD and typing in ipconfig, and it should now show the address for this computer. You can see its address is now set to 192.168.0.10. So that's perfect. Our XP computer is now successfully connected to our server, and we are ready to actually set up our server's Active Directory for computers and users, which we'll do in the next tutorial, as well as setting up shared resources like folders, folder permissions, and a group policy. Okay, so that's what we'll be doing over the following videos. As I say, we don't need to actually document this video. This video is only to get us as far as this computer set up to the steps, or with the steps that we actually need to complete the rest. Okay, so there's one last thing I'd like to actually do, and that is set up on VirtualBox what's called a snapshot, and it's a very useful thing, this. And this means that we can at any stage go back to this current state. So what I'm just going to do is I'm going to get the PCs exactly the way I want them. Okay, so I'm going to do is close everything. Now, so there's our Windows XP server, or Windows 2003 server, with a server set up, or a domain set up, and our Windows XP client connected to a server. I'm going to go back to VirtualBox and click the snapshots option in the top right with DDXP highlighted, and then I'm going to go this picture here, camera, take snapshot. Okay, and I'm going to name this snapshot tutorial to start. This XP client, you don't have to put a description in, but it can be useful whenever you're trying to work out what you actually mean by a certain snapshot. This XP client has been connected to the domain but has not been configured in any other way as of yet. Okay, so this means that at a later stage, if we mess up or we want to just even go through the steps a second time, we can double click on this. So for example, I'll show you what I mean. So my XP machine, I've now done something on it and oops, I made a mistake. I can now double click, or I can right click and go, I think I actually have to stop it first. I could click on this and restore snapshot. I just have to close the window first and that will go back to the previous state of XP. So throughout me doing the tutorials, you could have tutorial 2 start, tutorial 3 start, and so on and so forth. I should actually rename this, show details, and I'm going to call that tutorial 1 start, because technically this is tutorial 0. I can have tutorial 1, 2, 3, and 4 here, and that means at any stage I can go back to the start of those and redo the steps if I make a mistake or I just want to practice more. Okay, I'm going to do the same with our server. I'm going to create a snapshot at this point in time and call it tutorial 1 start. Active Directory has been configured along with DHCP, DNS, and DNS, so there's nothing really else configured at the moment. An extra admin account has been created and an XP client has been connected to Active Directory using an address given by the DHCP server. So that's a very full description of exactly what that does. I click on OK, and that means at any stage I can find out what that is. So we'll go, what show details? That's what this is. Alright, so that's now the end of this video. In the next video we'll go through the steps discussed. I hope this has been useful, and by all means ask me any questions if you get stuck. Good luck.